Hello, I am Thalie Martini, CEO of Breast Cancer UK, and welcome to the Be Well podcast. Today, I'm talking to a research scientist from the Silent Spring Institute in the USA. Now, if the Silent Spring Institute sounds familiar to you, you're probably thinking of Rachel Carson's seminal 1962 book, Silent Spring, which explores how pesticides harm our bodies and our environment. And it's a book which has been credited as heralding the modern environmental movement. So if you've made that connection, you've actually made the right one, because the Institute was founded as a tribute to Rachel Carson, who herself sadly died from breast cancer shortly after the book was published. Now today, the Silent Spring Institute is advancing her legacy by developing the science on the links between environmental chemicals and women's health, with a particular focus on breast cancer. Now, more specifically about my guest today, her research focuses on investigating the biological effects of chemicals that increase breast cancer risk. Through her research, she aims to classify chemicals based on their potential to increase breast cancer risk. Now, her work and that of Silent Spring Institute are actually really important to us at Breast Cancer UK, because we are also concerned about the links between breast cancer risk and exposure to harmful chemicals. And we believe that their work is helping plug that critical gap in our understanding of preventable breast cancers. There's also another reason why I'm excited about my guest today, and that is that she will be presenting the plenary lecture on her latest research at our 2025 Breast Cancer Prevention Conference in June. So I'm really thrilled to welcome Dr Jenniffer Kay to our podcast. Jennifer, so good of you to join us today.
Thank you so much for inviting me. I'm really excited to chat with you.
Yes, and I'm really pleased to meet you, particularly because we will get to meet as well very soon. But can we start by asking you really to explain what it is that the Silent Spring mission is all about, the Silent Spring Institute, and how is it continuing Rachel Carson's legacy?
Yeah, so Rachel Carson's life, death, and legacy really run as an undercurrent to everything we do at Silent Spring. Like Carson, we see exposure to toxic chemicals as a human rights issue. Essentially, no one should be poisoned, and we have a right to know if we're being exposed to toxic chemicals. We also believe that those in power have a duty to protect us. Also, like Carson, we are scientists who want our work to protect health and the environment. So our work, like you mentioned, revolves around identifying toxic chemicals, figuring out how people are exposed, and supporting efforts to reduce those exposures at the individual, community, and policy levels. So like you mentioned also, Rachel Carson was very concerned about pesticide exposures. That was the main theme in her book, Silent Spring. I am also spending a lot of time thinking about pesticide exposures and breast cancer, and Silent Spring was founded by breast cancer activists who were concerned about high rates of breast cancer in their community. The scope of our work now extends beyond breast cancer and pesticides to include other diseases and other types of exposures. But ultimately, the guiding light of our work is doing rigorous science to understand exposures to chemicals that can harm our health, especially focusing on women's health so that those exposures and diseases can be reduced.
And it's really interesting that you were founded by breast cancer survivors, because that's what happened with our charity as well 20 odd years ago. And those breast cancer survivors had that shared concern that we weren't doing enough to understand how environmental chemicals, how environmental toxins could be contributing to breast cancer risk. So it's a wonderful synergy there. And, we are prioritising breast cancer prevention at Breast Cancer UK, just like yourself. But one thing we do quite deliberately is that we say that at least 30% of cases, and we're very deliberate about the at least bit, are preventable, because there's so much we still don't know about the role that chemicals in breast cancer development plays. And it's also why we advise our supporters, and why we say very categorically in our policy work that we adopt and we promote the precautionary approach to exposure to chemicals. Is that something that you've adopted as well? And can you explain what this is for our audience?
Yeah, absolutely. So the precautionary principle is basically, assuming that chemicals are or have the potential to be harmful unless we have evidence that they are not. Now, that is sort of counter to the way that chemicals are thought of right now and the way that they're regulated right now, where they chemicals really don't undergo a lot of testing before they are used in commerce. And as a result, we don't have, the foundation of knowledge that chemicals are safe before they get used. So, we that leads to the risk that we will start using chemicals that could harm our health without actually knowing whether that's true before they get used.
Yeah, and that's a difficult thing to communicate to the public. And I'm thinking, for example, people who are very loyal to their brands, for example, cosmetics or health, personal care brands, for example, they're going to be quite loyal, and it's kind of difficult for them to take on board the idea that some of those products might actually be doing harm. How do you think we can tackle this? We've got the precautionary approach, but what it says is that, we're being precautious because we don't know for sure, but we also know that there's not enough being done for us to understand it. How do we tackle this issue around helping people to adopt that approach in their life?
Yeah, absolutely. Like you said, it can be hard to hear that the products that you've grown loyal to might, be harming your health, and it's hard to feel like you can do anything about it. How do you pick a new body lotion when it seems like everything in the store has fragrances or parabens and, dozens of other ingredients that you don't understand? And how do you figure out which chemicals are toxic when some scientists say yes, some say no, and you have to do deep dives to figure out who actually has a conflict of interest in that? So at Silent Spring, we want to give people actionable information that they can trust in language that they understand. So we communicate our science to other scientists, but we also have a free app called Detox Me, which is available in app stores and online. In fact, I checked and you can actually download this in the UK. And Detox Me has tips that really anyone can follow to reduce their everyday chemical exposures, taking whatever big or small steps work for them. We also try to communicate with policymakers who can actually regulate chemicals so that average people don't have to go it alone.
Yeah, and it is very interesting because once we start delving into where we find these chemicals, such as like everyday products, then it starts to get really complex. And even our supporters will come back to us. The most active ones will say, please give us some practical solutions that we can put in place. And you do have some really interesting tips, and I want to move on to that a bit later because some of them are quite specific, and it'd be interesting to dig a little bit more into that, but particularly to help people understand simple things they can do to reduce their exposure. But one thing about EDCs and environmental chemicals is that we are now starting to hear a lot more about this. A few years ago when I started out, we weren't hearing as much as we are today. So the popular press is picking up on this. We're hearing, for example, more about PFAS or forever chemicals. And there are some public campaigns kind of happening all over the place, including some of the more high-profile ones around water pollution and pesticides, for example. What's interesting about your focus, though, is that you specifically look at how chemicals may have a detrimental effect on our bodies, and in doing so, how they might increase breast cancer risk. A lot of the press talks about the pollution in our environment, but this discussion, this discourse around how these might be impacting on our breast cancer risk and other disease risk feels like an area that doesn't get enough publicity. Do you think we're paying enough attention to the health impacts? And why is it so important to?
Yeah, I mean, I think that we're not paying enough attention to the health, the human health impacts of pollution. And this is something that Rachel Carson also emphasized. Environmental and public health are inextricably linked. If we pollute the environment, then we expose ourselves through the food we eat, the water we drink, the air we breathe, and the time we spend enjoying the outdoors. So, plastics is one example for this one health perspective. Chemicals in plastics like vinyl chloride and phthalates are linked to breast cancer. Microplastics have now become ubiquitous in our environment, in our food and water, and in our bodies, likely harming our health in ways we can't even see yet. And plastics are made from fossil fuels, of course, which drive climate change. So it's really all connected. So, I think the environmental pollution and the pollution of our bodies, it goes hand in hand. We can't, you know, polluting the environment pollutes our bodies, but also, removing those chemicals from the products we use helps to prevent those chemicals from being released into the environment, when the chemicals are produced and also when we throw our products away or dispose of them down the drain or things like that.
Yeah, it's an interesting discussion that we have, and what we are calling for government to do here in the UK is to actually have a bit of a cross departmental approach, looking at it not just from the environmental regulation point of view, which is very important, but also to bring the health impacts together in kind of an overarching policy approach. And as you've described, the two they can't be disentangled, but for some reason we tend to talk about them as two separate things. And, I feel personally that unless we start to approach these in a coordinated way, it's going to be very difficult to tackle it. I mean, what are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, absolutely. The avoidance of letting toxic chemicals get into our environment also helps to, prevent those chemicals from getting into our bodies. I'll take the example of PFAS or forever chemicals that you mentioned. Also, DDT, which is one of the pesticides that Rachel Carson really focused on in Silent Spring. These are highly toxic chemicals that are extremely resistant to breaking down, so they are persisting in the environment and we can't get them out. DDT is still being detected in the environment decades after it was banned because it is so resistant to degradation. PFAS also are now polluting, every environmental sample that we look at. PFAS are there. So even as these chemicals are getting banned or phased out, they remain in the environment and we continue to be exposed. PFAS are more of a modern chemical crisis, and manufacturers are really kneecapping our efforts to reduce those exposures. As the PFAS that have tons of evidence now for being toxic get phased out, companies are introducing new ones that just don't have much testing data. And those companies hid the data showing that the first PFAS they produced were toxic, just like tobacco companies hid evidence that smoking causes cancer. And it's reasonable to be suspicious that PFAS manufacturers could be hiding evidence now and their new versions are toxic too. In fact, that's what independent researchers are finding, once they're able to test those newer PFAS chemicals, we're finding that they are still resistant to breaking down and they're causing similar toxic effects. Even if they're not quite as bad as the first PFAS that were produced, they're still not really, safe as we would hope.
And it's really interesting what you say, because I know your work is about understanding and predicting the actual impact of these chemicals on a larger scale. So what you're describing there seems to be very much in keeping with the work that you do. So can you explain a bit more what's involved in you doing that?
Yeah, so, one of the things that I'm trying to do with my work is, figure out how we can identify chemicals that might be hazardous, and prevent their use or reduce their use so that we can, prevent the health effects that those chemicals cause. There are too many chemicals in commerce that have not been tested for safety, and new chemicals keep being introduced that also aren't being tested. So we're falling way behind in knowing what our products might be doing to our bodies and the environment. So developing more efficient, effective, health protective ways to test chemicals for harm will allow us to support the development of safer chemicals and safer products, and also phase out chemicals that are, likely to be harming our health.
But are we able to keep pace, do you think, with the production of these chemicals? I mean, are we identifying the harms they can cause on a larger scale at the right pace for us to be able to inform government? I mean, do we have decent results that we can fall back on at the moment?
Well, I think the pace of testing is not as fast as I would prefer. I think we also need more of a systems level paradigm shift in how we think about chemicals. I would prefer that chemicals have evidence for not causing harm before they get used rather than, assuming that those chemicals are not causing harm. I think we also need to think about this, from the angle of testing, when we have chemical testing that shows that chemicals might be causing harmful effects, then that should be enough basis for us to act on reducing them. Chemical testing that's done in cells or in animals, some people will say, that shows that the chemical might have an effect in a test tube or in an animal, but how does that really relate to humans? And I think that we need to, recognize that, when we test chemicals in rodents, those are still mammals. If the chemical can cause cancer in rodents, then it, is reasonable to think that it might cause cancer in humans. And I would prefer for that to be sufficient basis for us to, phase those chemicals out or prevent them from being used. And similarly, if we can say that chemicals are disrupting hormone signaling or causing DNA damage in cells, then I would hope that that would be sufficient basis. We know that interrupting our hormone signaling and causing DNA damage are bad for our health. So I, would ideally use that type of evidence that we do have from the studies that have been conducted as a basis for, acting on those chemicals and preventing their use in commerce, or at least in certain applications where people are likely to be exposed.
I'm aware that the regulatory system in the States is different to in Europe and in the UK, but we still have some way to go. Since we left the EU, the UK left the EU, we no longer are part of the EU regulatory system REACH, and we've got our own UK system REACH, which is falling far behind, and so it's very difficult for us to keep track. Definitely at the UK level of new chemicals coming on the market and looking at their safety. Although in theory, chemical producers or those who are developing new products need to demonstrate the safety of those chemicals before they go to market. But as we know, there are different ways of demonstrating safety that may not always concur with what the science is saying. So there's a long way to go, but what fantastic work you are doing, and it's so important. You also are working specifically to understand how these chemicals might be causing the changes in the breast that lead to the development of breast cancer, and how also normal healthy breast cells become cancerous. Can you maybe talk us through a little bit this, and how why understanding these cancer pathways can also help us to identify the risks that certain chemicals pose?
Yeah, absolutely. So the more we know about exactly how chemicals change normal cells into cancerous ones, the better we can design efficient tests that predict whether chemicals are carcinogenic. And, that is going to be a lot more effective than trying to, test every chemical in an animal. Testing chemicals for their ability to cause cancer takes years and millions of dollars. So if we can develop more efficient tests, that can lead to better and more proactive regulations so that potential carcinogens can be phased out and replaced with safer alternatives. We can also develop those safer alternatives based on evidence that they don't activate pathways that cause cancer. Understanding how chemicals cause breast cancer also has implications for cancer treatment. So knowing the pathways to cancer can help to identify high-risk individuals who, are going to be particularly susceptible to cancer development. It can also help to design interventions that prevent or treat cancer, and it can help us understand how chemical exposures might be diminishing the effectiveness of cancer therapies.
And you've also created a database of mammary carcinogens. So it's like an all-encompassing list of chemicals, and all the chemicals that you've identified as having some link to breast cancer. Now, at Breast Cancer UK, we've come up with a list of A to Z of chemicals, probably not quite the same as yours, but nevertheless chemicals that we are concerned about because of their endocrine disrupting qualities. Now, I'm trying to understand how you came up with this list. How did you identify this very specific list of chemicals? And which chemicals in particular should we know about that are on that list?
Yeah, so our list includes chemicals that were able to induce mammary tumors in rodents because that suggests they could do the same in humans. And we also included chemicals that increase estrogen or progesterone signaling because those hormones are well established to increase breast cancer risk. So we looked for chemicals that cause cells to produce more estrogen or progesterone, and we also looked for chemicals that activate the estrogen receptor because those are both pathways that, can increase estrogen and progesterone signaling. Our database also includes a classification for whether those rodent carcinogens and endocrine disruptors are DNA damaging, because that's another important way that chemicals can cause many types of cancer. So this data had actually been generated for quite a few chemicals, although not as many as we would like, and we wanted to integrate it and present it in a way where scientists, policymakers, and consumer protection groups can identify the chemicals that are most likely to increase breast cancer risk and prioritize them for action.
And have you got any examples of how that list has been used?
Yeah, absolutely. So, one example is the Food Packaging Forum last year published a paper where they took our list of potential breast carcinogens and crossed it with their list of chemicals that have been detected in food contact materials. And they published on that, identifying the types of food contact materials that contain these potential breast carcinogens. We are also doing work at Silent Spring where we are, trying to partner with community groups to study their exposures to these chemicals. So, for example, we have a project going on where we are looking for these breast cancer relevant chemicals in products that are used by Black women to understand how they're being exposed, and we're partnering with community groups to communicate with those participants and with others to help them understand what chemicals they're being exposed to, and we're working with them to help them reduce their exposures. We have other community engaged studies going on with firefighters, nurses, immigrant workers. So we're really trying to translate this list to many different applications that can help, individuals act, but also trying to, share our information with policymakers so that they can prioritize chemicals for reduction at the policy level.
That's really interesting. I know that one of your values, one of your key values, is that we have all the right to live, work, and play in a safe and healthy environment, regardless of race, colour, national origin, or income. And I wonder if you can talk to us a bit about where that priority has come from and how it's helped you prioritize communities. Because the question, I suppose, for me is, in the States, are there certain communities who are getting higher exposure to chemicals than others?
Yeah, absolutely. We want everyone to be protected from chemical exposures, but we are particularly concerned about, groups of people who are particularly highly exposed. So that is one of the reasons that we are working with Black women and community groups that engage with Black women, because Black women are known to be highly exposed to chemicals through their personal care products. There have been studies showing that Black women are particularly highly exposed through their personal care products to certain chemicals. So, it's, a matter of environmental justice. Part of the reason we're working with firefighters and immigrant workers is also because, with firefighters, that is an occupation where there is a lot of exposure to toxic chemicals. So they are, at particularly high risk of developing cancer. Immigrant workers are understudied in, what chemicals they're being exposed to. We're trying to figure out what kinds of workplaces, are having the highest exposures to hazardous chemicals. We're also working with communities that face high levels of pollution. So, we have some studies going on where we're engaged with communities who are exposed to PFAS in their drinking water. We have also worked with a community that lived near a refinery, trying to help understand their exposures. Actually, that was a partnership where this community was concerned about their exposures from the refinery, and we were interested in what they were being exposed to through personal care products. So we worked together. We both had these different questions that sort of came down to what chemicals are these people being exposed to, and we were able to answer sort of both of those questions in a single study. And the results of that study actually helped this community, try to advocate against expansion of that refinery.
So it has an incredible, so working directly with those communities, first of all, does it have an impact on their awareness? I imagine it would. And also, as you described, does it give them the tools to actually advocate for themselves? And what kind of broader impact does it have for other communities like them who haven't been involved in the study?
Yeah, absolutely. So, taking the example of some of our work with firefighters, they were concerned about workplace exposures. So we tested their blood and urine for chemicals, and we reported back to them about their occupational exposures. So providing them with that information allowed those organizations to, on their end, they've upgraded their decontamination protocols, started a worker training program, and they also advocated to get breast cancer recognized as an occupational health hazard. And in the state of Massachusetts, where we're based, that information actually allowed them to, get breast cancer recognized as an occupational exposure related disease. So they are now able to get workers' compensation, medical care, and job protection because of, information that we gave them. Allowed them to have, a basis for advocating for recognizing breast cancer as an occupational related disease.
And I imagine with these population groups, in particular, exposure of women in the workplace, it's not a very highly studied area, isn't it? Will this have an impact on future studies or on regulations in other workplaces where women might have these exposures?
Yeah, when we worked with this group of firefighters, it was one, group of firefighters in the state, but the implications of their advocacy now extend to all firefighters in the state of Massachusetts. And, the work that we've done with these individual firefighter stations also can extend past what happens at that station and go through their national organizations to influence policies around the country.
And you've described a lot of communities that are very kind of contextually tied to the US, work conditions and exposures. But do you think some of these communities that you've described, that similar communities in the UK might also be getting higher exposures? Is that something we might be seeing in the UK as well?
Yeah, absolutely. We have firefighters in every country. So, certainly there might be differences in, some of the workplace exposures between, the sort of fire station, flame retardant chemicals that are used in turnout gear. Some of the chemicals that they use to fight fires may be different, but ultimately, a lot of these occupations are inherently highly exposed. So the results of our studies are not, confined to the US. They are really applicable to, everywhere that people are in these jobs. Similarly with farm workers, the pesticides, the specific pesticides that might be used in the US may be different in some cases from what are used in Europe. Um, but there are probably also pesticides that are used in both places. Um, it's also, worth mentioning that the regulation of chemicals in the EU is often stronger than what we have in the US. And that regulation of chemicals in the EU gives people in the US a basis to advocate for stronger regulation. We can say, well, these allies recognize this chemical as being hazardous. We should too.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, they've recognised it for because of the science and because of the impact they've seen on communities. And it is interesting that your work does extend beyond the US. I mean, your focus is on women's health, and you don't address it as though it's a unique issue to the US, although you do look uniquely at women and girls as a universal, approach. And in your view, is there a wider global issue that is faced here, and how can we act on a, say, global scale to address this? We have different regulations in different countries, different very specific issues in terms of exposure, but how can we act on a global scale, particularly to protect the health of women and girls?
Yeah, absolutely. Like you mentioned, chemicals are everywhere, and breast cancer risk factors, are universal. They include things like air pollution, chemicals and products that everyone is using. These exposures are everywhere. And, breast cancer itself is a worldwide concern. So breast cancer is now the most common invasive cancer diagnosis worldwide, and rates are rising worldwide. And those rising rates are happening fastest in younger women. So in fact, two-thirds of early onset cancers worldwide happen in women, and most of those diagnoses are breast cancer. Interestingly, breast cancer diagnosis rates are especially high in more developed countries, but mortality rates are especially high in less developed countries. These, trends and rising rates of cancer and, the high incidence rates, high mortality rates can't be explained by, risk factors like obesity or decreased fertility rates. So we have strong reason to believe that the environment is playing a role. And, regulation in certain countries, and especially when it's, something that affects commerce and the economy, it is, sort of often more efficient and effective for a company to change formulations of chemicals so that they can, or formulations of products so that they can sell them anywhere. You can have one formulation of a product that you sell in the US that's different from what you sell in the EU, but ultimately, if kind of everything is made the same, that makes it easier to use a single formulation that you can, distribute worldwide. I also just wanted to mention that I'm really glad you mentioned women and girls because early life exposures are so important at increasing the risk of breast cancer later in life. It's also, worth noting that chemicals that increase breast cancer risk can also, alter pubertal breast development, which is happening earlier and earlier in girls everywhere. They can also impair the ability to breastfeed, which is also a concern that's affecting many women worldwide.
Do you feel that it's still being treated, the whole kind of environmental risk factors, do you feel it's still being treated as a bit of a niche area. We certainly feel that. And how do we start to engage with those big public health players on this issue?
Yeah, I definitely agree. We need more attention on the environmental risk factors for breast cancer and, all diseases. There are tons of diseases where risk is modified by environmental factors. So I would love to see more attention on how our everyday exposures, the chemicals in our products that we assume are safe, how those might be affecting our health. Um, we, can influence things at the policy level by, advocating for better regulation. That can often be slow and very challenging to convince regulators that they need to restrict those chemicals. Another way that we can influence, chemicals in our bodies and in our environments is by taking this issue to the to manufacturers and retailers. People can shift markets to safer products through their purchasing power and also by asking manufacturers and retailers to take chemicals out of their products. So as one example, REI is a big outdoor apparel and equipment chain in the US. I'm not sure if they are also have, a more international presence, but they took PFAS out of their apparel because of consumer demand. Our studies also helped prompt fast food companies to take PFAS out of their food packaging, and now states are actually starting to create laws that ban PFAS in food packaging. So it can be a slow process, but we can come at this issue from multiple angles. Regulation is one of the better ways to prevent our exposures to chemicals because that applies to everyone. But in the absence of regulation, there are other ways that we can approach this problem. Even if it's one company at a time, that can lead to, this compounded effect where other companies will follow one company's lead and, remove those chemicals if they recognize that that's what consumers want.
Yeah, and we've seen how regulations had an impact on how manufacturers approach, the chemicals that go in their products, and BPA is a good example of that. In the EU, it's been phased out, and so rather than wait for the chemicals to be banned, the manufacturers started changing, what went into their products, sometimes using regrettable substitutes, mind you. But as you say, there's where regulation lets us down. I think there really is power in the public going to their favourite brands and demanding that their favourite brands actually take those chemicals out that we're concerned about. But there are also other opportunities coming up, and I want to just touch on our breast cancer prevention conference, which we're really thrilled to have you at. You'll be speaking there, and there'll be lots of different scientists and delegates all coming together in the same room. What are your thoughts? What do you hope will be gained from this conference?
Yeah, I'm really excited too. I love the, group of people that you're trying to reach with this conference. One thing that is great that comes out of, most scientific conferences is that scientists need to be communicating with each other so that we can find ways to work together, build off of each other's work, and accelerate science. But what I am really excited about with this upcoming conference is that we also need to get this information to decision makers so that knowledge isn't limited to scientists, but also gets applied to protect people's health. So sharing this expertise and getting information into the hands of people who can use it lets us find solutions faster.
Yeah, absolutely. And that's what we definitely hope to achieve, both in terms of hosting this conference, Breast Cancer UK, but bringing these really, really important conversations together so that we can take the evidence directly to policymakers, also get some interest, some public discourse, and get our supporters as well on board to say, well, we've got the evidence, we now need to make some important changes. But on the kind of individual level, we mentioned it earlier on, but I want to come back to the really interesting tips that you provide on your website on how people can avoid avoid exposure to chemicals. So we've talked about regulation, how important that is kind of, globally to help protect us, and also how individuals have kind of power from their own kind of purse, I suppose, if they decide that they no longer want to buy a certain product. But then at home, we can do things as well. And we often hear from our supporters that there's lots of things that they can do to reduce their risk, but sometimes they feel really complicated to achieve because they might be too expensive or, too complex. So I've gone to your website and I've picked out a few, because there's loads more, but I've picked out a few that I thought were really good. And then maybe once I've gone through them, if you could explain what is it that makes this set of advice important for reducing our exposure. So I've got 6, bear with me, but I think they're all great. Number one is count how many products you use on your hair and skin each day, then look for one or more products you can live without. 2, avoid buying moisturizers or other skin treatments promising younger skin. 3, avoid cleaning products that promise to protect against stains. 4, choose smaller seafood over big fish. 5, adopt no shoes at home policy or stop outdoor toxic chemicals at the door with a doormat or rugs. And then finally, choose polyurethane. Polyurethane, you could probably pronounce it better than me, polyurethane coated waterproof shells over vinyl or fluorochemical raincoats. So there's quite a list there, but I thought they were quite specific. And why is it that making those changes can help reduce our exposure?
Yeah, so I'm going to try to remember all of those and go through each of them. So starting with the personal care products. Personal care products, they can include a lot of different ingredients. Not everyone can, take the time to really figure out what all of those ingredients are and which ones are, potentially harmful. So we have actually found in our work that simplifying your beauty routine, or, in for people who are already using fewer beauty products, they have lower levels of chemicals like parabens, which are endocrine disruptors. They have lower levels of those chemicals in their bodies. So trying to, just cut out products that you don't need, especially if they are products that like stay on your skin all day, that can help to reduce your exposures. Um, Let's see if I remember all of the others. I
The
might go out
younger,
of
the
order.
younger, the younger you moisturizers.
Yes, so those can contain endocrine disruptors. The products that contain those can the chemicals that sort of achieve that younger looking skin can often be endocrine disruptors.
Yep, so we want to avoid those. What about stain removers?
So stain removers, well, especially stain resistant products, that function of being stain resistant is often achieved by adding PFAS to the product. So, a major function of PFAS chemicals is to, prevent stains. So it's effective to help reduce the amount of PFAS in your life, in your homes, in your bodies by avoiding things that market themselves as being stain resistant.
I wish I'd had that advice when I bought a couch years ago. And the selling point was, this is great because it just doesn't stain. All you have to do is wipe it and it comes off. So, and I know now why it works so well. Um,
Yes.
and also the other interesting one is the smaller seafood over big fish.
Yeah, so that is sort of a matter of the food chain. So chemicals that are very environmentally persistent, they can accumulate in bodies, so in our bodies and also in the bodies of wildlife. So, if you take PFAS as an example, if you have some small fish that are, eating things. They might have some degree of accumulation of PFAS in their bodies, but then bigger fish that eat those smaller fish, they get all of the PFAS that were in those smaller fish, and that builds up even more. So the further up the food chain you go, the more you can, concentrate those bioaccumulative chemicals. So that's true for PFAS, and it's also true for mercury.
Yeah, yeah. So, and also smaller fish tend to be very high in all the kind of omega-3s that we need, and the kind of oily fish tend to be really small, don't they?
Yeah.
And adopt a no-shoe at home policy.
Yeah, so that helps reduce the amount of pesticides that get tracked into your house. When you are walking around outside, you can end up, getting pesticides onto your shoes. And then if you take your shoes off at the door, then the pesticides stay right by the door. If you walk through your house, then that can start tracking those pesticides through your house, which, especially can be concerning if you have small children who spend a lot of time on the ground. Just trying to keep those sort of outdoor chemicals, even if you're not using pesticides in your house, you might be going into spaces where pesticides are used. So it just helps you sort of avoid any possibility of tracking those pesticides into your house.
And finally, although this isn't the last piece of advice you can get, but finally, the alternative waterproof shells.
Yeah, so this again comes back to PFAS chemicals. So PFAS are, confer stain resistance. They also confer a water resistance. So, often raincoats that are sort of like, vinyl or a fabric that's treated, that treatment is often a PFAS chemical to create the water resistant property.
The frustrating thing about PFAS is it's just so useful, isn't it? It's become so useful.
Yes.
That's fabulous. And there's a lot more advice on your website where that came from. We at Breast Cancer UK also have a very comprehensive guide to how to avoid exposure. So there's no shortage of advice out there. Thank you so much for answering all of our questions. It's been really fascinating. Now I have a few more kind of personal questions I'd like to ask you, if you don't mind.
Of course.
We ask this of all our guests, so this is the same segment for everybody. And the first question is, if you have one, what is your biggest guilty pleasure?
Ice cream, definitely. I know, it's not super healthy, but I love it, and I eat too much of it, and I'm not going to stop.
I'm with you on that one. The older I get, the more I like ice cream. I don't know why, but I love it. Now, also, what we'd love to hear, and our listeners would love to hear, is if you have any books or podcasts or films that have inspired you to be well, or inspired you in your life generally, that you'd be happy to recommend for us.
Yeah, well, one is probably an obvious answer. Silent Spring, the book, is really fantastic. Even though it was written decades ago, the same story is still playing out with different companies and different chemicals. I thought the movie Dark Waters was also a really well done illustration of what happens when companies hide the toxicity of their products. So Dark Waters, is the story of PFAS manufacturers releasing their chemicals into the environment. Farmers were losing livestock, and then a really tenacious lawyer did a lot of work to get the harms of PFAS recognized. One other thing I'll mention is there's a mini series on HBO, at least available in the US. I'm not sure if it's in the UK, called Not So Pretty, which is about chemicals in cosmetics. and the harms that they can cause.
Well, no, that's a topic that we're very much focused on discussing at the moment ourselves. And again, we're starting to see more in the press. So fantastic advice on all three, and definitely read the Rachel Carson book and the documentary as well. Now, have you got anything on your bucket list? What are you wanting to achieve? You've achieved an awful lot. Is there anything else that you're planning to achieve?
Yeah, well, one thing that professionally, I would really love to hear from someone that my work changed their lives or prompted a policy change. It would be really awesome to work directly with policymakers on strengthening chemical regulations to support cancer prevention. On a, sort of personal level, I think it would be really cool to go scuba diving one day, especially before all of the coral is gone.
Oh yeah, well, if you hear my accent, there's a coral reef in Australia worth visiting. But as you say, how long for we don't know. Yeah, but yeah, fantastic. Yeah, and I agree. I think that's a call out. I'm sure there are lots of people out there who you've inadvertently helped, but it would be great to hear it, to get that direct feedback, to see the impact of your work. Your talking at our conference is going to be a big part of sharing your work and sharing your knowledge, and that will have a huge amount of impact. Where else can we find out about you and your work for our listeners?
So Silent Spring's website is pretty easy. It is just silentspring.org. So you can learn all about our nonprofit on our website. We also have a social media presence. Silent Spring Institute is on, LinkedIn, Instagram, Facebook. Wherever you're getting your social media, you can subscribe and hear more from us, get sort of the, updates about what we're doing and what we're achieving.
Fabulous. Well, we'll make sure that we put all of that in the show notes, including your recommendations. And Jenny, thank you so much for your time. It's been a delight talking to you.
Oh, and you too. Thank you so much for inviting me. This has been really fun.